By the final months of the Second World War, Nazi Germany no longer resembled the triumphant empire that had once marched across Europe beneath fluttering swastika banners and thunderous speeches. The Reich that Adolf Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was collapsing in real time, and for the first time, this collapse was being captured not only in grainy black and white, but in color, revealing the end of the war with a brutal clarity that stripped away myth, propaganda, and illusion. These color images show a Germany in ruin, cities burned to their foundations, civilians wandering through rubble-strewn streets, and soldiers fighting on amid hopeless odds. This is the story of those final days, told from inside the crumbling Reich itself. By late 1944, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany was catastrophic. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had smashed through German defenses and was advancing relentlessly westward. Entire German army groups had been destroyed during Operation Bagration, one of the most devastating defeats in military history. In the West, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and were pressing toward Germany's borders. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skis, had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft, veteran pilots were dead or captured, and raw teenagers were being thrown into cockpits with barely any training. Yet despite this grim reality, the Nazi leadership continued to promise victory, clinging to fantasies of miracle weapons and last-minute reversals. Inside Germany, the war had come home in full force. Allied bombing campaigns had turned major cities into seas of rubble. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, Dresden, names that once symbolized German power now stood for devastation and death. Color footage from this period shows entire neighborhoods flattened, with only skeletal building frames left standing against smoke-filled skis. Civilians picked through ruins searching for food, possessions, or the bodies of loved ones. Children played among bomb craters. Old men and women pulled carts loaded with whatever they could salvage. These were not scenes of a nation preparing for victory, but of a society struggling to survive day by day. The Nazi regime responded to this collapse with increasing desperation. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, called for total war, demanding that every remaining resource, human or material, be thrown into the fight. Factories were worked around the clock, even as bombs fell. Women, teenagers, and forced laborers from occupied Europe were driven into production lines under brutal conditions. The Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia made up of boys as young as 14 and men well into their 60s, was formed to defend the Reich. Armed with outdated rifles, improvised weapons, and little training, these units were expected to stop tanks and seasoned Allied soldiers through sheer willpower. Color footage captures the tragic reality of these final mobilizations. Young boys in oversized uniforms stand nervously beside elderly men with hollow eyes. Their faces reveal fear, exhaustion, and confusion rather than fanaticism. Many knew the war was lost, but refusal to fight could mean execution. Desertion was punishable by death, and military police carried out public hangings to enforce obedience. The regime ruled through terror until the very end, even as it lost control of events on every front. As Allied armies closed in, life inside the Reich grew increasingly chaotic. Transportation networks were shattered. Trains lay twisted on bomb tracks. Roads were clogged with refugees fleeing advancing armies, especially in the east, where millions of German civilians escaped in fear of Soviet retribution. Horse-drawn carts, handcarts, and overloaded wagons filled highways once used by panzer divisions. Color images show endless columns of displaced people moving through snow, mud, and ruins, carrying children, bedding, and memories of homes they would never see again. In the east, the approach of the Red Army unleashed terror among the civilian population. Years of Nazi atrocities in the Soviet Union fueled fears of revenge, and in many areas those fears proved justified. Entire villages were emptied as civilians fled westward. Some committed suicide rather than face capture. The collapse of order led to widespread suffering. Rape, looting, and violence became grim features of the war's final phase. These scenes, when viewed in color, are especially haunting. Red brick towns scorched black, blood-stained snow, and faces frozen in shock and despair. Meanwhile, the Nazi leadership retreated further into fantasy. Adolf Hitler withdrew into the Führerbunker beneath Berlin, increasingly isolated from reality. He pored over maps, ordering non-existent divisions to launch counterattacks and refusing to accept reports of defeat. Generals who spoke honestly were dismissed or ignored. Hitler placed his hopes in so-called wonder weapons, jet aircraft, advanced submarines, and rockets like the V-2. But these technologies came far too late and in numbers too small to alter the outcome of the war. Color footage from German cities during this time reveals a striking contrast between propaganda and reality. Posters still promised victory. Newspapers spoke of heroic resistance. Radio broadcasts declared that Germany would fight on until the enemy was destroyed. Yet behind these messages, the Reich was rotting from within. Food shortages were severe. Coal was scarce. Electricity failed frequently. Families survived on thin soup and ration cards that provided less and less each month. The war economy, stretched beyond its limits, was unraveling. Inside bomb shelters, civilians endured long nights as air raid sirens wailed and explosions shook the ground above. Color film shows cramped underground spaces filled with exhausted faces illuminated by flickering lights. Mothers clutched children. Elderly men sat silently, staring at nothing. When the all-clear sounded, survivors emerged into streets transformed yet again. Another building gone, another fire raging, another body covered with a sheet. The psychological toll of the war's end was immense. Years of indoctrination had taught Germans that defeat was impossible and that enemies were monsters bent on annihilation. As Allied troops crossed into Germany itself, many civilians expected mass executions and total destruction. Some welcomed the end of bombing and fear. Others remained loyal to the regime until the final days. This divide fractured communities and families, leaving a legacy of guilt, denial, and trauma that would last generations. As winter turned to early 1945, the Reich was fighting for survival on all fronts. In the West, Hitler launched one final gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was intended to split Allied forces and force a negotiated peace. For a brief moment, German units achieved surprise, pushing through snow-covered forests and capturing towns. Color footage shows panzers advancing through white landscapes, their camouflage stark against the winter terrain. But the offensive quickly stalled. Fuel ran out, Allied air power returned, and German losses were irreplaceable. The last major offensive of the Third Reich ended in failure. From that moment on, defeat was inevitable. Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The Red Army surged toward Berlin. Germany's cities fell one by one. Inside the Reich, the end was no longer a distant possibility. It was an approaching certainty. Yet the fighting continued, driven by fear, ideology, and the ruthless machinery of a regime unwilling to surrender. This was the final act of Nazi Germany, and it unfolded in vivid color. A collapsing empire clinging to delusion, a population caught between loyalty and survival, and a war that consumed everything in its path. In the next chapter, we will follow the Allied advance into the heart of the Reich itself, into the cities, towns, and streets where the Third Reich would meet its violent and irrevocable end. By early 1945, the war had crossed Germany's borders in a way that no propaganda broadcast could hide or soften. Allied soldiers now marched through towns that had once been symbols of German strength, and for the first time, civilians inside the Reich witnessed enemy troops not as distant threats, but as physical presences on their streets. Color footage from this period reveals a haunting transformation. Villages with intact church steeples standing beside scorched tank wrecks, green fields torn apart by artillery fire, and German civilians watching silently as foreign armies passed through their lives. The illusion that Germany could still negotiate, resist, or reverse its fate was dissolving with every kilometer lost. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces advanced methodically across the Rhine and into the industrial heartland of Germany. The Ruhr Valley, once the engine of the Nazi war economy, became a battlefield of collapsing factories and shattered rail yards. Color film captures smokestacks standing idle, their brickwork chipped and blackened, while Allied armor rolled past abandoned machinery and empty workshops. The encirclement of the Ruhr trapped hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, many of whom surrendered without a fight. They emerged from forests and factories with hands raised, faces pale, uniforms filthy and threadbare. These were not the confident conquerors of 1940, but exhausted men relieved that the fighting was finally over for them. Inside German towns, reactions to the Allied invasion varied widely. Some civilians watched in silence, fearful of retaliation. Others cautiously displayed white flags from windows or doorways. In rare moments caught on color film, German children approached Allied soldiers out of curiosity, drawn by unfamiliar uniforms and foreign languages. For many civilians, the arrival of Western Allied troops meant the end of bombing, the return of food supplies, and a chance at survival. But fear lingered. Years of Nazi propaganda had painted the enemy as brutal and vengeful, and trust did not come easily. As Western forces advanced, they uncovered evidence of the crimes that had sustained the Third Reich. Forced labor camps were found near factories, filled with prisoners from across Europe who had been worked to the brink of death. Color footage shows gaunt figures standing in striped clothing, their faces hollow, their eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were visibly shaken by what they found. These discoveries began to dismantle any remaining illusion that the Nazi regime had been merely another wartime government, rather than a system built on mass exploitation and murder. Meanwhile, in the East, the Red Army advanced with overwhelming force. Soviet troops crossed into Germany itself in January 1945, smashing through defensive lines that existed mostly on paper. Entire German divisions collapsed under the weight of artillery barrages and armored assaults. Color footage from the Eastern Front shows endless columns of Soviet tanks rolling westward, their hulls coated in mud and snow, red stars standing out starkly against gray winter skis. For German soldiers and civilians alike, the Eastern advance was terrifying in its speed and brutality. German civilians fled in massive numbers, particularly from East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania. Roads were jammed with refugees pushing carts, pulling sleds, or simply walking westward with whatever they could carry. Color images show women wrapped in coats several sizes too large, children clutching blankets, and elderly men leaning on sticks as snow fell around them. Some refugees froze to death on the roadside. Others were caught between advancing armies and artillery fire. The collapse of civil authority meant there was little protection, food, or medical care for those on the move. Within Germany's remaining military units, morale was disintegrating. Many soldiers knew the war was lost, but continued fighting out of fear of punishment or in hopes of surrendering to Western allies rather than the Soviets. Desertion increased despite harsh penalties. Military police and SS units enforced discipline through executions, often carried out publicly as warnings. Color footage shows bodies hanging from lampposts with signs accusing them of cowardice or treason. A final, grotesque display of a regime that ruled through fear even as it collapsed. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler's world had shrunk to a few concrete rooms beneath the ruined city. The Führerbunker became the center of a dying empire. Cut off from reality, Hitler ranted about betrayal and imagined counteroffensives. He placed blind faith in commanders who no longer had armies to command. Color footage of Berlin above ground shows a city reduced to ruins, streets choked with rubble, shattered tram lines, and buildings burned down to their facades. Civilians scavenged for food among the debris, while artillery thundered ever closer. As Allied bombers continued to strike, even Germany's remaining cultural centers were not spared. Dresden, once known for its architecture and art, was engulfed in a firestorm in February 1945. Color footage taken in the aftermath reveals a city flattened almost beyond recognition, its historic buildings reduced to ash and stone. Survivors wandered through the ruins in shock, their faces smeared with soot, their clothing torn. The destruction raised difficult questions even among the victors, questions about the cost of total war and the line between military necessity and human catastrophe. Across the Reich, infrastructure collapsed, water systems failed, hospitals overflowed with wounded soldiers and civilians alike, medical supplies ran out, and doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia. Color images show makeshift hospital wards filled with stretchers, bandaged figures lying shoulder to shoulder, and nurses working until exhaustion. Disease spread quickly among displaced populations, adding another layer of suffering to an already broken society. As March turned into April, the final battles loomed. The Western Allies pushed deeper into central Germany, capturing key cities with increasing speed. The Red Army encircled Berlin, sealing the fate of the capital. Inside the Reich, the sense of inevitability became overwhelming. Some civilians welcomed the approaching end, hoping for peace at any cost. Others remained trapped in denial, clinging to rumors of miracle weapons or last-minute negotiations. Color footage from these final weeks is especially powerful because it removes the emotional distance created by black and white imagery. The red of fires, the green of military uniforms, the pale faces of refugees. These details make the collapse of Nazi Germany feel immediate and real. This was not a distant historical event, but a human catastrophe unfolding in living color before the eyes of the world. As the noose tightened around Berlin, the fate of the Third Reich was sealed. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but how much more destruction would occur before the fighting finally stopped. In the next chapter, we will enter the final battle itself, the siege of Berlin, the death of Hitler, and the moment when the war in Europe came to its violent and unforgettable end.